Poker's legendary champions, next generation stars, and tireless ambassadors of the game, sharing their wisdom and guiding your journey to high achievement on the green felt. This is Chasing Poker Greatness with your host, Brad Wilson.
Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Brad Wilson. And today's guest on the show is the always thoughtful and contemplative master of live poker tells, Zach Elwood. Zach's a former professional poker player, podcaster, and author who's also doubled as a poker tells consultant for 2 WSOP Main Event final table combatants. His books, Reading Poker Tells, Verbal Poker Tells, and Exploiting Poker Tells, have been called invaluable, transformational, and required reading for live poker. In the same social psychology vein as his poker books, Zach's also recently been investigating the impact of social media in amplifying our divides and increasing polarization, which you're about to learn all about. Spoiler alert, it's not your imagination. 50% of the time, poker Twitter sucks every time. In today's conversation with Zach Elwood, you're going to learn how to honestly appraise your skills and abilities, why being a Jack or Jane of all trades can only help you out in your poker journey, what you ought to do when you inevitably make a blunder on the green felt, and much, much more. So without any further ado, I bring to you the always brilliant and insightful longtime poker pro and influential poker author, Zach Elwood. Mr. Elwood, good morning, sir. How you doing?
Hey, Brad. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. It's been a while. It's been a long while if you consider how the last year has gone. And so I guess we'll start there. How has the last year been for you, sir?
Oh, good. I definitely feel on the luckier side of things, with everybody, many people struggling out there. I definitely feel like I was on the luckier side of that aspect. So have no complaints in that area. But yeah, it's as for everybody, I'm sure the distancing and has been tough and not seeing people and not going anywhere. But yeah, I got no major complaints and hope you're doing good in that area as well.
Yeah, I don't have any complaints. I mean, being an online poker player, pretty flexible as to where I can do business. So that's been pretty fortunate this year. So what have you been up to during the pandemic? What have you been working on?
Well, I actually have a full-time job. So I work for, I don't like to say the name just because I do some of those investigations and stuff, but, private things I do. But I work for a software company and do technical writing for them. So in that regard, I felt lucky because I've been out of the, poker scene for a while. So I don't play online or anything. So doing that and then also working on some personal projects. Like I worked on the podcast, the psychology podcast, and then also working on, I don't know if you saw that, I worked on some social media polarization stuff, like how social media affects us. And I spent, I actually took a few weeks off work to work on this project, researching and writing this piece about how social media may be amplifying our divides and extreme thinking and stuff. And that was a big passion project for me.
Well, tell me, what did your research yield? What's the final result for the listener?
Well, if you want to check it out, it's on Medium. It's like apokerplayer.medium.com, or just search Zach Elwood Medium. But it's called How Social Media Divides Us. And basically, the reason I was interested in that is because I just kept seeing, indicators that people I knew and on social media and friends and family were having increasingly like illogical thoughts and like extreme like us versus them thinking, in the way they spoke. And so I want to dig into that. And I also had, what began it was I had noticed a study from the 50s, which seemed really relevant to me, that people who write things down, even secretly to themselves, but especially if they write things down that other people see, are more stubborn about those views. They cling to them more tightly. And that seemed really relevant to me, to social media. And I sent that to John Haidt on Twitter, who writes about social media effects. He's like real well-known psychologist guy. And he retweeted it. He didn't know about the study. And as far as I know, I'm the only person that has made that connection to that specific study. And it really rings true in my life. And I can relate to it because it's like we all have that, we write something down publicly on Facebook or Twitter, and then we have that urge of like defending it when people point out it's wrong or whatever. And so that was one aspect of it. And that led into me, the fact that nobody else apparently made that connection to that study made me want to look into other studies and other effects. So yeah, that's what led to the piece, basically.
That is a really sharp connection. And, I've done a lot of studying on high performers, done a lot of studying on mindset and being resilient, like as a poker player. And basically with self-image, it's when you verbalize something, when you put it on Facebook, you are now going to try to live in that image that you have presented publicly. That's just human nature. And I did not make the connection that when you put this stuff out there on social media, that's part of your identity. And then it affects your thoughts and how you live. That's actually a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, and I think we focus sometimes on the positive aspects of that, like making goals or stating goals publicly. But it's like I think the negative side of it is we're all in a way that's never been done before. Like the fact that social media is has basically it would be shocking if there weren't major effects for how it's impacted our thought. Because this is such a new way to communicate. And in most of human history, our conversations were just like ephemeral, like they would pass away and nobody would think about them again. And you could change your mind easily because you weren't on record, but now we're constantly putting everything we think and say on record and getting peer pressure and responses and anger even. That was the other big thing, is like looking into the effects of, what are the effects of getting insulted online, which I think plays a big role. It's like when we get insulted, it can have a radicalizing effect because we're like, not only are we more likely to stick to our guns, it makes us feel like we have a grievance, and now we start to build our identity around like people are attacking me, and I think that happens to a lot of people that I've kind of seen go down the rabbit hole where they, it's like a combination of factors, I think, but I think insults and perceived grievances and the feeling that you're under attack, which happens often on social media, all play a role too.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, to me, there's like layers, and this is something that I teach my private coaching students. We talk about it while they're playing their session. They send me a play and explain video. We review it in the coaching session, and I ask them to verbalize their good decisions and try to keep score. Whether you make a good size value bet, it's 1-0, right? Because as you're verbalizing and giving yourself affirmation for making good decisions, you're more resilient when you make a bad decision because you realize the score is like 13-1 instead of 0-1. And that's just the filter of having a thought and then expressing that thought verbally. And when you write it down and share it publicly, that's like a whole nother level of commitment to that thought, idea, or belief.
Yeah. And relatedly to that point, I think, it's similar to how sometimes I'll be insulted by people on both the right and the left. Like I get kind of hate sometimes from both sides, but I'll have that feeling when that happens of, this means something, like something horrible is happening to me or something like, but I have to remember, sort of like you said, it's like, put this in context. It's like, these are just some random people I don't even know on the internet. It's like, back up a second. And similar to how you have to do with, not being results oriented or not recent results oriented. It's like, take the big picture and back up a minute and be like, this is not a big deal. Like at the end of the day, you're just being insulted by a very small percentage of people. And, and there can also be that perception of like, these people attacking me represent like a large number of people, but no, they don't. They just represent themselves. It's, you have to back up and think about the big picture. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can give them as much energy or attention as you want. I think that is in your control, but we are human beings. Maybe we're not biologically suited for social media anyway.
Totally.
Yeah,
I mean, right. I mean, that's my opinion. It's like, if we're going to I really think it's like almost an existential threat in the way it amplifies group versus group dynamics and how that might lead to, more, I think, I've talked to, for my podcast, I've talked to political experts on like polarization and how things degenerate in countries and have degenerated in many countries. And, many people think that social media is playing a role in amplifying these things.
It must. And the way that the platforms are set up, it's set up as really us against them because of the content that we're shown, right? Like I was messing around on social media just maybe a few months back, and I followed people, or I was going down the rabbit hole of looking at tweets from people whose ideology I completely disagree with. And it was almost shocking the amount of people that agreed with the people whose ideology I disagreed with. And it's just something that is totally filtered out from my feed. Right. So like when you encounter somebody that has tons of different beliefs, it's almost jarring because it's like, whoa, like where did you come from? There's people that really think that. But yeah, of course they do. It's just the algorithm filters them out and you never see that. So people just agree with what you say, reinforce what you say. The retweets that you see are things that you typically agree with. So in ways, it's manufactured exponentially. The danger is exponentially increased because of the way that the social media platforms themselves work.
Yeah, it's like, and that was the thing, the piece I wrote was in examining inherent effects, because I really think there are some inherent effects apart from product choices, but I think the product choices and the algorithms and such add to that. It's like another layer on top of it. But I think the interesting thing too in that area is like a lot of the talk you see in that area from like the talking heads on the documentaries about social media, they're always focused on like the product choices. But I think I'm always expecting them to be like, there's some inherent things going on here that are regardless of product choices. It's the fact that we're all wired together more closely, and the fact that we're basically like an organism that has become like even more wired together, and that has good effects in terms of like quick communication. But it also means like it's basically acting like an amphetamine, like the bad ideas and the extreme ideas and the us versus them thinking and the polarization like spread out that much more quicker and amplify. And that's what I see happening. And I think it's also important too, because some people are like, well, polarization is good because we're fighting bad people. The other people are bad for these reasons, which, I'm not going to, and I completely agree in the sense that I think Trumpism, for example, it represents a horrible thing. But I think, there's two levels here. It's like the actual issues, which are a lot of people are not that misaligned on. Like when you actually look at the diversity on actual issues within each political party in the US, it's like there's a lot of overlaps and not, less disagreement than people think. But then you have like the psychological, like us versus them mentality on top of that, which becomes more like group dynamic, like psychology, emotional polarization than it is like issue polarization. Like I've talked to conservative friends, and we have, on the actual issues, like we're able to have like a reasonable discussion on like what are the actual issues. But then the more it becomes like this us versus them dynamic, the more skewed those things get, where like the more extreme views start to take hold, on either side.
I mean, it's really, the game is the game of power, and it's always been that way. And when you pit us against them, especially in a two-party system, it's just a game of let's see how long both parties can maintain power, push everybody else out so that we just keep in control for as long as possible. And when it's us versus them, there is no alternative option. I mean, there are better voting systems that could be implemented in the United States that help third parties run, that make it feel like, your vote isn't just getting thrown away when you vote for a third party. But, that's sort of, it's all, as somebody who's invested a fair amount of time in marketing and sales over the past year, it feels suspiciously like marketing and sales. Watching the debates, the vice presidential debate, I was watching it and listening to both Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. And what was super interesting to me was just how they would reemphasize talking points, and they would have key words that they would just say over and over and over again. And I realized that like they're not speaking to the people who are already on their side, because those people are already there. They're speaking to the people who are in the middle. And so they're like both just jamming these key words and trying to label one another. And it was just fascinating verbal warfare. And I just realized then and there that like, oh, they're selling their party and their vision to the people who are on the fence. And that's really what politics is. It's just selling. You hear ads, just we're in Georgia. Like I'm in Georgia, right? So we had the dual Senate runoff that decided the majority in the Senate. And basically every piece of media, every song I listened to on the radio, every YouTube video that I watched, I probably heard 1,000 ads over the course of that month. I mean, they were just back to back to back to back to back. And yeah, it's amazing. Like it's just amazing how much of marketing and salesmanship the world of politics really is, with the game being kind of rigged to keep both parties there. And
yeah,
with regards, that's what they want.
With regards to, I started thinking about how much not an original thought, but I started thinking about how much our system of voting and how it's set up, leads to these dynamics, like you said, like it's like people act like these are choices people are making, but at the end of the day, I think it's the structural aspects that lead to this stuff. And if you had a different, like, what is it, ranked voting or whatever, that would be a different system, would lead to entirely different outcomes. But the way that we're structurally set up leads to this us versus them thing, where it's like it has to be very polarized, and then the polarization continues to increase over time. Like we've been increasingly polarized in terms of like Senate voting, since like starting in the 60s. It used to be more diverse, like the voting across parties, and then like starting in like 60s or late 60s, it was like started drifting apart, where it became increasingly dysfunctional and increasingly polarized. And I think, social media is just another layer on top of that dynamic. So yeah, it's like these I often feel people try to examine like moral failings, where it's like, these are kind of like, humans are humans. Like we're living in some sort of structure that we've created, and that leads to these weird outcomes naturally.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, right? Like, I don't know how we found ourselves going down this
I don't know
road.
If that's what you want to talk about, but
I mean, it's interesting to me, and I hope it's interesting to the listener, but just, the velocity of fake information, right? It spreads at like 10 times the rate of real information, mostly because fake information is more fun, right? It's more catchy. It's
sometimes more angering. Like anger is a big spreader of emotion, of information.
Yeah, and we have the ability now to create deep fakes. I mean, people can just simulate audio of pretty much anybody. Like somebody could take my voice and make me say anything on a piece of audio, and it sounds exactly like me. And you can't discern whether it's real or not. And it's just all of that makes for a very, very scary time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're only getting started. I mean, you add in all this technology and new weapons that are going to be created in the next few years, and man-made diseases. It's a crazy time to be alive for a few reasons. Yeah.
All right, so I will agree 100%, and let's dive into some poker stuff. Let's start out the poker stuff by asking you, who is your biggest influence in hopping into the world of cards?
Oh, for getting into poker. Well, there was this, I was into poker a bit, and then in college, I started getting into it and setting up games and stuff. And there was I don't know if you know this book. I'm having trouble remember the name. It was, if I can Google it real quick. It was like Franklin Wallace or something. Poker, a Guaranteed Income for Life. You ever heard of that?
No, but that is a hell of a title.
Yeah. So it's a pretty cheesy, bad book. Like this guy was basically like one of those early, this was back in the 60s or something, where he wrote this kind of sensational, over the top poker book involving like a lot of reads and tells and stuff and psychology, and like him, the main character, he would do these various things about the main character, like worming his way into games and like psychologically messing with this group of people, and like get it, all these psychological tricks he would use, like, I'm going to put a sandwich in the pot like late at night when everybody's hungry, and make this guy more likely to go for it. It was all these kind of funny, not purposely funny, but it was meant to be like a psychological, mastermind so it was pretty cheesy, and now I think about it years later. But it was an inspiration in terms of like, he did actually have some cool stuff in there that was like, oh, this guy obviously played some poker and had some interesting observations, even though he was over the top. Like he self-published and was like putting ads in newspapers. It was this kind of like thing back in the day, and made a bunch of money from it apparently. So I read that in college. Like I couldn't even find the book. I like printed out, pages from it, and like this was like 2000, and his psychological angles as over the top that they were, got me interested in the psychology side of poker and the tell side of poker. So that person was probably a big influence, as weird as it was. I think it's still a very fun read. Like I think I read it again, it was just a few years ago, I think, and it was still a fun read. It was kind of like a round, like reading a rounders version of poker, where it was like everything was like kind of over the top, but it was still fun.
I mean, I could see how those stories would be impactful for you. Like that's way more impactful than like the theory of poker, right? Just it's very dry and mathematical heavy.
Right, exactly. And one of the reasons, I was initially interested in poker was the psychology side, because, I'd played chess a bit too, but I like the fact that in poker, you had these hidden variables basically of like things that weren't obvious, and you could do a lot with those hidden variables, and that was interesting to me versus the dryness of chess. But then, of course, back then I didn't understand how complex a game poker was strategically, and how much there was to the kind of game theory and strategic side when I started out, and learned to respect that, as I got into it more. But
yeah, the game theory is an untamable beast in and of itself, and then you just sprinkle in the random and crazy nature of human beings, and you got yourself a pretty fun game that stands the test of time.
Yeah, that's the great. I've always loved poker because you could spend your life on it really, and it feels like something like that, where it's like martial arts or anything, where it's like there's so many factors involved and so many approaches you might take, and so many hidden learnings, that it has that interest of like going down the rabbit hole of a very interesting subject. Yeah.
So tell me a story of your favorite poker session ever, or most memorable.
Most memorable is probably a very painful one, where I was playing in Albuquerque, where I played live and online when I was playing for a living back in the day, and played in a pot limit Omaha game. I think it must have been 5-10, I think. And I was in the hand with two other people, and semi-bluffed on the flop and the turn, and they both called me. I think I had something about it. I just sensed weakness from them, whatever it was, and they were. I had a pair of twos, a pair of deuces in the hole, so I was really bluffing, like I didn't have many draws possible or anything. So, and the board was really scary. It was like a bunch of high cards, all kinds of straights possible. And then so on the river, it goes check, and I just muck my cards, because I'm like, not even thinking in pot limit Omaha I could be good. And of course, for like a multi-thousand, it's like a couple $1,000 pot or something. That would have been good. Pocket deuces, and so that was weird. They both had like the exact same cards, like for the same kind of double draw or something.
Oof.
That was memorable, and I was kind of on tilt for like several days.
Yeah, I believe that. I have somewhat of a similar story. It's probably a little bit even more embarrassing, but it was not a massive pot. I believe I was playing 5-10. It was like $800 or $900, and I got it in with sevens. The flop was like deuce tray. I got it in, and the dude had ace 5, and like the turn was a 4 and the river was a tray, and he just tabled his ace 5, and he's like, I got it straight, but I assume you have a full house. And I just kind of looked at him like, why would I have a full house? Like, and I just mucked my sevens. And then I looked at the board and I saw that the river tripped the tray. I was like, oh my God. Like, it's a thing that takes some time to get over, because it's just so shocking like that. I could have made that mistake more times in my life, but maybe I just never noticed. But this one I noticed.
That
and
stings.
yeah, well, I even had the thought of, why would I have a full
Wait,
house?
what?
Like the board's like deuce, tray, 4. Like it's a 3-bet pot. I don't understand.
Some of the, when you make that, honestly, like that was the thing. That's the thing I found hardest about poker. Like in terms of the thing I found hardest about poker was forgiving myself for stupid mistakes. Like those really add up, and I feel like I never had a problem. Like I found the other parts of it not that stressful, but I think it's maybe just because I'm like got a perfectionist mentality. I really I really was hard on myself and beat myself up for mistakes, And I think that's like the, the under acknowledged side is the mental game of poker. Cause I don't think some people just maybe because they have alligator blood or don't care about those aspects. Like some of that stuff they can't even relate to, where it's like beating yourself up and then like kind of going on tilt for a long period of time because you're angry at yourself or whatever. I think a lot of people have those problems, and then some people just can't relate to them. And I think I see, people like Mason Malmuth, like, saying like, oh, there's nothing to the mental psychology side of, or mental game of poker kind of stuff, because it's not like sports. And I'm like, actually, there's a lot of stresses in poker, and they can really mess your brain up,
It is, once you have the theoretical expertise down or you're playing at a high level, I mean, it's mostly all the mental game of poker. I mean, anybody that's played poker for a moment will realize that your heart rate elevates, your stress levels rise. Like there is an emotional dump. You win a giant pot, it feels one way. You lose a giant pot, it feels another way. And of course your body's going to be stressed out. And of course it's going to have an effect on you psychologically, because this is the game.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just I don't think they realize that part. I mean, I think some people just are natural, like when you talk about the crushers at poker, I think some of them are naturally well equipped, and these things don't bug them as much. They're just much more non-emotional, and can overcome that stuff.
I just don't believe it. I don't buy it. I think that like whenever you have somebody competing at the highest of levels, they got there through a lot of self-torture. They don't get there by making the same mistake multiple times. Mm-hmm. And with that comes, just a lot of pushing yourself, being extremely, extremely difficult on yourself, and finding those kind of mistakes unforgivable, because they have to be. If you're going to play at that level, those kind of mistakes do have to be unforgivable. And it's really hard to seek that kind of forgiveness in yourself. And it's just a thing that like I try to do something every now and again. I think that the impulse we do in my community, we do Poker Power Hour every week. And I think the impulse of people when they share hands to do hand history reviews is to share the hands that they win or that they played well, when I don't know about them. I've been a professional poker player for 17 years and have always had one of the highest win rates in any pool that I've ever played in. And my database is riddled with regrettable decisions. I mean, there are just way too many to count. I really can't play a full session without making a regrettable decision. And I think that people's impulse is not to share those, is to kind of share the ones that turned out well, that went well. And I've just over time learned, it was during a card runners video, actually. I called the river with Jack high in a significant size pot playing 1K and L. Basically, the flop was like 7-8-4. I was playing against a whale. I had Jack 10, and the turn came a tray, and the river came a tray, and they jammed the river, or they didn't jam, actually. They bet like everything but $200 that I had back. And I called the river with Jack high because basically I had the nut gut shot. They were a fish. They were repping something that was pretty incredible, and they ended up showing deuces, right? So they accidentally bluffed and got called by a worse hand. And I was making a play explain video for card runners, and as soon as the hand went down, because I'm doing it live, I thought, should I just scrap this video? Or should I just release it? Because this is kind of a crazy call that I made on the river with Jack high. And ultimately I just said, screw it. I'm just going to release it, and I don't care. And over time, I've learned that putting those mistakes out there, or those things that just didn't go perfectly well, on Twitter, social media, my Slack group, Cover the Hands and PPH, makes me a more resilient poker player because, because of that vulnerability of like, I don't play every hand right. And because I don't play every hand right, I can forgive myself when I make that mistake playing in game. And that's just so valuable, right? If again, let's go back to self-image. When everything you put out there are all the things that went well and all the right decisions you made, when you make a wrong decision, it's probably going to be a lot more painful and hard to forgive while you're in the arena.
Yeah. And I think the fact that poker is so complex and, over the years, it's kind of like many pursuits where Dunning-Kruger where you realize as time goes on, the areas you really don't know, like, there's all these common spots in poker that were like, oh, they seem like reasonable common spots. And I think I know, I'm fairly confident that these are, that I know that fairly normal, good thing to do here. But when you get down to it, like, because we've learned how complex poker is, it's like, I think many of us, even the best players, are often operating in like kind of assumptions of the best things, and that's become more clear to me over the years. Where I'm like, I do all these things when I play that I think are good strategies, but when I really think about it, I'm like, is that the best strategy? Like, I mean, there's just a lot of doubt. Like the more you learn about poker, I think the more awareness you have of these gray areas and like other options you could be taking. And I think, kind of having accepting that you are operating in a lot of times in things that are more complex than they seem. And that leads into being more able to forgive yourself in terms of like, well, there's only so much I can know. Like, I'm never going to know everything about poker or the best approach in every spot. There's just like, you're going to make mistakes, your whole life. And you have to be able to forgive yourself for that.
Yeah. You're not always going to make the correct play against the correct opponent in the correct situation when both of you have the exact mindsets that you have when there's metagame going on. I mean, the variables are basically endless. You just can't hold yourself accountable to making every decision perfect, because nobody does it. And the more resilient poker players are the ones that can practice that self-forgiveness and with curiosity look at the hand through a lens of what can I learn something from this? Because I am 100% behind the belief that you ought to make mistakes playing poker, and you ought to make them fairly regularly. And they can be mistakes that cost you money, or cost you money in the short term, but make you money in the long term if you're willing to investigate and sort of learn the lesson from those mistakes, because we got a lot more poker to play throughout the rest of our lives. And one lesson that saves you a couple of stacks down the road is very, very valuable.
Yeah. And kind of to your point, it's like I have found value in, the instinct to beat myself up or get angry at myself is valuable in the sense that I'm motivated to not do that again and learn from that moment and be like, what am I going to learn? What did I learn from that? And like break it down and like think about it for hours and, that kind of thing. I mean, I think that does help. And then, I don't know. I think there are people though that can do that without the like psychological pain. Like, I don't know. I feel like I'm on the more sensitive side of that stuff. And I feel like some people are like, I'm going to do that work, but not feel like bad about it. I don't know. I don't really know, because I'm sure it's a spectrum of stuff, but yeah.
I don't know. I just, we're human beings. We're all born with emotion, and I don't want to meet a poker player that can just turn their emotions off while they play poker, because they're almost like not a human being at that point, right? Like, I don't think we have the capability of just switching off bad feelings, like a light switch, right? I
would have liked to study see Patrick Antonius's like readout for like his heartbeat and skin conductivity test and stuff, like see how, because he always seemed like somebody that just like dead cold and nothing affected him. But I'm sure maybe he gets irritated as much as anybody.
No, so surprisingly, Zach, I believe not last year because there was no WSOP last year, but like 2 years ago, Patrick released like an Instagram video. He had busted all the money he had brought from wherever he lives and to the WSOP to Vegas. He had busted it, and he was it was a very vulnerable video, and he was quite upset about about going through the whole summer, building it up, and then losing it right at the end. So even somebody like Patrick Antonius, like, he does get affected, right? I think that those type of players, again, we talk about self-image, they don't really put it out there when they do get affected. They keep it to themselves. They don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. They just try to put on the front that like nothing ever affects them. But I just don't buy it, because I've talked to so many of these guys, and they're thoughtful, emotional human beings. And the reality is, like, it's just going to affect you.
Yeah. And I guess it helped back then that some of those guys were getting cushy deals with the online poker sites, and we're rolling in dough. That probably helped them relax a little bit too.
Yeah, it probably doesn't hurt when you know you've got a few $100,000 coming in at the end of every month.
Yeah. Take a loan from Full Tilt or whatever they were doing.
Yeah, just cash advance.
Not to say Patrick Antonius was doing that, but
yeah, I mean, basically when there was a lot more money in poker pre-Black Friday, and poker players had various income streams, I mean, they all got paid $1,500 an hour to film high stakes poker, which really doesn't seem like that much when I think back on it, just from like a production standpoint. It feels like they still got underpaid. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But yeah, they're making money from a lot of different sources. And
yeah, those were the golden days of poker for sure, for poker celebrities. Yeah,
absolutely.
In a world where a fish donk bets the flop, and you don't know what to do, one man,
Coach Brad Wilson,
has a surefire plan to neutralize flop leads and rip that dunk to shreds. Nuffle. Available now. Go to chasingpokergreatness.com/nuffle. Rated R.
So, John, you've used neutralized flop leads in the past 24 hours, correct?
Yeah, so I got basically the slide with all the info on it on Friday evening, and yesterday I played a session of 1KNL on Ignition and played one particular pot that I remember where a fish just donked flop turn river into me, and I ended up winning with a hand that I would have folded before looking at the slide, but I ended up winning like a $400 pot instead, and the course is $99, so definitely paid for itself very, very quickly. And I think that'll be the case for even people that aren't playing as big as 5-10 no limit. Like, I think this is a course that will very, very quickly pay for itself given how much more donking there is at lower stakes. And I think one of the most common questions I see asked in the Greatness Village Slack group is, what do donks mean? How do I deal with donk bets? I think that's got to be like in the top 3 most frequently asked questions.
You ought to feel very excited when somebody donks into you, because some good things are about to happen.
You said like you probably don't need anyone to teach the course, or like you can just look at the slide and learn all the info yourself. I feel like you, Brad, will have to be there, because I'm almost sure that anybody who looks at the slide won't believe it looking at what they're supposed to do, and we'll have to confirm with you that like you didn't make a massive typo somewhere and that this is actually what they're supposed to do, because it's pretty shocking the optimal way to deal with fish donking into you on the flop is.
If you'd like to check out Neutralize Flop Leads so that you're never again confused when a fish leads into you in a single raise pot, head to chasingpokergreatness.com/nuffle. That's chasingpokergreatness.com/nuffle. And now, back to the show. Could you tell me a poker lesson you've learned from a dark teacher? So bad experience, something like that.
Oh yeah. Well, probably one story was when I went to Casino, Arizona, and where is that? What's the main?
Phoenix.
Yeah, Phoenix. Yeah, I went there, and I had I was going to go play some higher stakes stuff, like some limit games there, and I thought I was hot shit. This was back in, my early days of playing in like 2006 or something, 2005, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna go play some 30-60, 40-80 or something limit games, and then I just got crushed though really quickly. It was like Patrick Antonius losing his role at the World Series. I was like, I was real nervous too. Like I was like playing really badly and wasn't used to playing at those kind of stakes, and went through a bunch of money, and I was like kind of regrouped. I was like, yeah, I think I got to re-examine my estimates of my own skill and mental, mental confidence and stuff like that. So that was like a tail between the legs moment that gave me some humility and, set me up for doing better later.
Yeah, tell me, what did it set you up for the next time that you decided to move up or play a bigger game?
I think it just, you got to have humility in poker, because you have to have an honest appraisal of your abilities in the big scheme of things, and honestly appraise like, hey, maybe I'm not the best player at the table, and these guys seem quite confident, and what are they doing well that maybe I could learn something from, and at the time I was kind of cocky because I was coming from Albuquerque where there was like no good competition, and everybody sucked, and I thought I was hot shit, and so that was like kind of a wake up moment where I was like, oh, like I should think more about the game, and I've seen I had friends that I think weren't as, it's tough to be honest with yourself in that regard, and it's tough to say maybe I suck basically and need to do a lot of work. And I think I had friends and acquaintances that went through a hard time psychologically and financially because of, I don't think they weren't able to do that, and they weren't able to say, hey, I'm playing online against some increasingly tough competition, and I need to examine how I'm doing, and think about my game, and have I really thought through my game very well, or have I just been coasting on the fact that everybody sucks back then, So I think that humility is necessary, and honestly, I think it's tougher than people know. Like the psychological stresses of being like, of going from feeling like you're on top of the world to being like, hey, maybe I'm nothing really, and I need to think more about this area. And it's humbling, and it can be psychologically painful for people.
Oh, it can be psychologically devastating.
Yeah.
And it's something that people can avoid facing the truth and just kind of take the ostrich approach of bury their head in the sand and assume that, they're running bad, or they have, a million different factors to blame that are all pointing outwards without anything pointing inwards as to their approach to playing poker. And, I hear a common sentiment out there in the world about poker training specifically, that people will say that poker training is cost prohibitive, it's too expensive. And it always makes me laugh a little to myself that anybody who understands the pot odds model of poker and poker training will see that you really can't price poker training too high, because, if it's $200, you're paying $200. And for the pot odds model, basically, if it does what it says it's going to do, it will 50x that. So pot odds say call. Pot odds say to invest into this, all of these different things so that you can learn or try to take one concept, apply it to your poker game, and it just improves or maybe it expedites your learning process, right? Maybe it shaves 3 years off your poker journey, and you get to where you want 3 years earlier. I mean, what is that worth? Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So really, it's just, it's a framing, right? It's saying, okay, I'm going to trust something. I'm going to invest this money into my poker education, because that's what it is. And the reality is, in life, you always invest into any form of education. It costs lots of money, way more money, going to traditional colleges to earn a skill set that is worth way less money at the end of the day. So anyway, that's my little rant on like poker training, and just the industry as a whole. Is like, when you understand pot odds, you ought to invest in these things. You ought to invest in yourself. And to your friends that struggled back in the day, it's a hard thing. But like, when you really think about the amount of money that's on the line, it becomes a no-brainer of like, let's seek outside help. Let somebody give me their opinion, an expert opinion on how I'm doing, that can judge me without bias and just give me that feedback. Because sometimes that's the thing that you need. That's the catalyst that propels you forward. And, you just have one of those come to Jesus talks and you're like, okay, I got to do better.
Yeah, I think it's related to how the toughness of poker in the sense that with poker, it's so easy for people to be delusional about their own skill set, because often the sample sizes can be small and people can do well in the beginning and do badly later. I think and it sets them up to feel like that some people don't feel like they don't need help because they feel like they're special. They're like really skilled. Everybody's got this. A lot of people have that ego thing, and that can be hard to overcome. And yeah, and I know people that they should never have been playing in these games online back in the day, as the games got tougher and they couldn't face the fact that they were outclassed basically, and they were like people still believe it was rigged or whatever they believe. Like it's tough to face those facts. And I think getting outside help, getting training, getting input from better players than you or just as good players as you is key to is part of overcoming the ego part of things and saying, yeah, I need to think about these things more objectively.
Absolutely. The rigged thing, that's just, again, a pointing a finger at anything other than yourself.
Yeah.
Good friend of mine who's been a professional poker player for years used to have a saying when somebody would call a site rigged, he would say, well, good for me then, because every site I've ever played on has been rigged in my favor. So it's worked out for me. Right. And if you're listening in the audience and you tend to blame factors that are not yourself, take a hard look in the mirror, because really that's the one thing you can control is your own development. And if you're just blaming everybody else, then, well, you're probably not going to develop much. All right. So back in the day when you were grinding, what would you consider a weakness that you had related to your poker game? And then what steps did you regularly take to overcome that weakness?
Oh, well, I think I was too aggressive for one thing. I that was a big weakness on my part. And I think it came from reading a lot of, some books and maybe some, pop culture kind of stuff that made it seem like aggression was really, where to be, like Doyle Brunson's super system, which made it sound like you're always like hammering people and stuff. And I think that I was kind of in that mindset for a long time. And I think I got away with it, I think, for a while because the competition was so weak in the early days of the poker boom and such. But I think I had to, and I think that ties into the ego thing too, where you're like, I'm going to be the most aggressive person at the table, and I'm a force to be reckoned with. But I think the learning of like, there's nothing inherently good about that. Like you should be adjusting to whatever the table is like, even if you're being exploitative or whatever. It's you have to take a step back and be like, what maybe the most money is in taking another approach and just laying low or whatever, just based on whatever the game's like. So I think learning that to tone down the aggression was a big factor for me.
Well, I mean, you have a spectrum of tools, right? You can check, you can call, you can raise, you can bet, and those tools all have utility. Checking has a utility. Calling has a utility. So, like you said, pop culture in poker back then was always be folding or raising and don't be doing much calling, right? And
right. Calling is weak.
Calling is weak. And that's like one of the most damaging oversimplifications of poker that probably exist in the world, because of course there are times where calling is the only appropriate option. And
just like checking is quite appropriate sometimes. And,
exactly. There are times where checking is totally appropriate and calling is appropriate. And you just have to learn how to use those different tools. And maybe that makes poker a little bit more difficult because you have to add some subtlety to your game or some nuance. But guess what? Poker is a difficult game. You're not going to be able to win at poker if you just eject multiple tools from your tool belt because you don't know how to use them. This game, in this day and age, you're not going to be able to beat poker if you choose to go about it in that way.
And I think it was added to my problems that I was, being always interested in the psychology and tells side of things from early on. I could always justify my aggression because I'll be like, well, I'm gonna maybe learn something from how he reacts to this bet, and then, so that kind of made me more likely to bet too, And so it was all tied together. I'm like, I had to learn to, take a calmer, more objective approach and not try to be the boss of the table or whatever.
What's funny is, psychologically speaking, there's things that happen psychologically when like a short stack gets committed to a pot, right? Like I preach in my private coaching sessions and on Poker Power Hour about sunk cost fallacy. And if an opponent has like half their stack committed and they're a short stack, they're likely to take aggressive actions because the pot is meaningful to them. They've sunk half their stack in the middle. And, say it's a 3-bet pot, there's 200 in the middle, and the flop is like 10-9-4, and you have aces. Well, checking is going to almost always be the best play there against a short stack with SPR of around 1, because they're just going to pile with whatever they have because they need to win that pot, psychologically speaking, right? So like, that's sort of again a funny misnomer that psychology only is in effect when you're aggressive, when the other players on the receiving end of aggression, because also when you feign weakness and check, psychology comes into effect there as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a factor. Yeah, in so many spots.
Yeah, most all the spots, I think. Against weaker competition, psychology's in play in pretty much every single spot that you get in against them.
Right, because even if we talk about how complex and nuanced the game theory side of things is, most of the time you're playing exploitatively against weaker competition. I mean, especially live and not so much probably online, but usually when you're playing weak players live, you're aiming for exploitative things based on, a little bit on their
patterns.
Yeah.
We're finding patterns, it's not just pure randomness. Human beings are patternistic creatures, and they will do things subconsciously, betting patterns, timing tells, just whatever it is, they exist if you're willing to dive deep and look for them. What do you think is a common assumption people make about their poker careers they should spend some more time thinking about?
I don't know if it's an assumption, but I think it feels like these days people should have backup plans. I think some younger people, it probably is less true these days, but I feel like some people think assume the poker will, whatever they're doing with poker will go on forever. But I think it's good to think about the if it's not there, if it dies off for whatever reason, becomes harder, think about other plans you have. Maybe that means like, if you're playing poker, teaching yourself to code or something in your off hours or something to have a backup plan if things aren't there. I think that's true of like probably any pursuit. You should always have some sort of backup plan.
Yeah, those redundancies in the world of poker are very, very valuable. And like, even if you're in full on poker mode, you mentioned poker just like as a whole, if it is not viable. And I don't think that's going to be the case, just kind of across the board. I think that like maybe No Limit Hold'em Cash online has a demise, but there's always tournaments, there's always live tournaments. There's always live cash games. I think learning different games, Pot Limit Omaha, some of the limit games, some of the mixed games, so that if one form of poker dies out, you still have a backup plan. Just even that outside of a brand new skill is extremely valuable, so that you have options, right? Melissa Burr came on the podcast and was saying that like she wanted to know all the games because when she walked into any poker room, she wanted to be able to sit down at the most profitable game in the casino, wherever that was, right? And there's a lot of power in having those options available to you by, increasing your skill set and venturing out of the world of just, no limit Texas Hold'em.
That makes sense. Yeah, being flexible. Yeah.
What are some things in your poker career you wish you said no to more often?
Loaning people money. Yeah. I mean, I'd say, yeah, I was a bit too loose with money when I was doing well, when things were going well, and, that led to problems. And I probably wasn't, there's probably that people that had a lot more worse situations than I did, but still it was kind of like distracting, and also like hurt some friendships and stuff like that, where I could have just not loaned them money and everything would have been fine, things like that. Yeah. I think that can be tempting whenever, for anyone that's doing well in poker. And then there's that temptation sometimes to share the wealth or something, but I think it leads to weird outcomes. It's kind of like doing business with your friends and family. It can lead to bad outcomes.
Yeah, and when you're young and immature and don't have much life experience, it's like, okay, I've got $10K in $100 bills in my pocket, and somebody asked for $1,500. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal, and maybe it's not that big of a deal to you, actually, if you're a successful poker player. But the downside is that friendships get affected, and when you don't value that money, that person's not going to value paying you back. You're going to be just the absolute last human being on the planet that they pay back. And the downside is that it can cost you friendships and relationships that are way more valuable than the 1,500. So in my opinion, if that's something that you're inclined to do, just give it away and don't think about it again, because otherwise there's a lot of bad things that come after it, and you end up typically not getting paid back regardless.
Yeah, then it's like people might be, the other angle of that is like your friends or acquaintances might be broke, and then you feel bad even asking for it back. It's like, oh, okay, I'll just forget about it.
Right. Like, or something happens, like, especially if you're young and 3 years pass or something like that, they get married, they have children, they're struggling to survive. They have all of these expenses. And then, you have this in the back of your mind, like, oh, they owe me 1,500. And you're like, okay, so I can either hold on to this forever, create bad energy in myself, or I can just let it go and pretend like it never happened. And ultimately, I've learned that just letting things go, pretending like it never happened, is just the better course of action, just for your own sanity.
Right.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of downside into holding on to that, those poor feelings.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And then, you never know when they're doing well, if they're doing well later, then maybe they'll pay you back then or something.
Yeah, maybe, but
maybe not.
Not a thing. Just out of my head. Like maybe they do, and that'd be nice. But if they don't, they don't.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No. That's been my approach too. Yeah.
What are some things that you wish you had said yes to more often in your poker career?
Probably going over hands with other poker players. I wish I'd kind of taken my ego out of things earlier on and sought, third party help or help from other poker players that were as good at it as or better than me. And
why didn't you?
I think it was kind of like that ego thing. It took me a while to realize that maybe I wasn't the best, and lower the ego and realize like other people had things to offer. And I think so. I wish I had gotten to that point sooner, because that would have led to much better outcomes earlier on, versus taking longer to improve, that kind of thing.
And the reality is, Zach, and I'm sure you're aware of this now, but for the listener, the reality is that it doesn't matter how good you are. There are always lessons you can learn from discussing hand histories with other people, whether it be the perspective of a player who's operating at a lower level. Maybe you get an insight into their decision-making process that you had never noticed before. Maybe they see an angle that you just skipped over because you discredited it straight away, but maybe, it's valid or has some merit that you ought to consider. Nobody's got it all figured out. And just because, you play poker at a higher level than somebody else does not mean that you cannot learn from that person. I think that there's a wealth of information that you can learn from pretty much everybody that you come in contact with as it relates to poker, whether they're better or worse than you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think, I would have done more of that. It was probably because I was a bit antisocial at the time too. And but I would have sought out more talking about hands. Yeah.
Well, back in our day, you had to be pretty social to get involved in those things because it wasn't like just joining an online training site community just as easy as that to plug in. It was, you got to actively seek these people out.
Yeah. And I could, there was still like 2+2 back then. So I could have like done more of seeking out that kind of thing, or just people locally that I played with in Albuquerque. I was also kind of like sometimes afraid of the perception of like being in some sort of clique with people, like giving the perception that like the people at the casino would think like we were, colluding or something like that. I was always kind of afraid of that thing too, but I think I was a little bit too afraid of that than I should have been. I could have reached out and talked to people and made more friends in the poker scene.
Yeah, I don't think the casino. I don't think the casino could. I think they could care less
I know,
who you hang out with.
Well, not the casino. I mean the players.
The players.
Yeah.
I don't think they care either. I think
I don't think most people care either.
There's sort of this unspoken agreement, at least in my mind. How I work is like we can go outside and we can talk about poker, and that's cool. When we sit down in our chairs and we're playing against each other, it's on. And both of our jobs is to beat the other person into oblivion. And that's just like the unspoken, unwritten rule of battling against your friends. Like, go hard and leave it all on the felt when you stand up and leave, because it's hard. Poker's hard enough without trying to navigate these sort of relationships while you're playing cards. It's a big enough psychological minefield without that. So just let everybody know, be upfront. Like, I'm going to try to bust you when we're playing against each other, and I'm going to go for the jugular. And I would be disappointed in you if you didn't go for my jugular in the same way.
Yeah, for sure. That should be unfortunately, I have seen that not happen, but that's
me too.
Yeah,
I've seen it not happen many times, and it's just
it gives and I think the worst thing about it is it gives a perception to other players at the table where it's like you've got like three players that are known as being good or whatever, pretty pro level, and like two of them are like kind of like taking soft lines to each other. That perception's really bad to other people, and I'm like, what are you all doing? Like, even just for perception, like, play hard, play hardest as you can versus each other.
I think it shows a low poker IQ, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. And I should say these are people that I didn't really respect their games or professionality or whatever.
There's not one poker player that would do such a thing with another pro that I think is a good player. Like I've never come across that in the world. Maybe it exists somewhere, but it's
insight into their bad thinking. Yeah.
Have you ever strongly believed something about poker only to reverse course later on? And if so, what led to that change of belief?
Oh, it was probably, one example that with the poker tells angle is thinking that was, when I first started out, thinking that was like a lot of people that get into poker initially, it's that romantic idea of tells and being a big part of the game, that you're getting reads, constantly or whatever, or that you will eventually be able to do that. And kind of in the Hollywood version of poker, that's a thing. But then, as you take poker more seriously, you realize that's just like a small percentage of adding to win rate is the tells stuff, and you can go a long time without ever using that information, behavioral information for even if you're a very good reader. And I think coming to a more realistic understanding of that was, I think everybody a lot of people that get into poker, not online players so much because they don't think about that as much, but I think that the more amateur recreational players that start out into poker can have that kind of perception that tells are some big important thing, and that leads to them like being afraid of being read, like, oh, somebody's going to read me, and I had that when I started out. I'm like, oh, these professionals are going to read me, and I have to be really careful. And then like as time went on, I'm like, yeah, most people aren't paying attention to that stuff, and it's even if they were, it's like they might only occasionally get a read or something off me, So yeah, that reaching a more realistic understanding, I think, was a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a data point that can influence your decisions when appropriate. Sometimes it's a high priority data point, and sometimes it's a lower priority data point. And it's just like anything as it relates to bet sizing, timing tells, patterns, data, all the stuff. It's just one part of figuring out what the best, or what you think the best decision you can make in the moment is, not the end all be all. Not even Phil Hellmuth can look at somebody and read their soul without any data points, right? The line they took, the bet sizings that they make, historical information, all of that plays a larger role, or just as large of a role, when Phil Hellmuth makes his decisions, as their physical body language and how they're carrying themselves. And that's just the reality of every poker pro that I've met. It's a data point. Sometimes it's ultra valuable. Sometimes the whole massive pot can hinge on that one data point, and most of the time it doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. It's a small. Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's like probably one of the main benefits people get out of reading my stuff, is like putting it in a more realistic connotation, context, where like I actually went back and edited my first book because I realized I didn't make it clear enough in the intro. Like, look, you're not going to be using this very often. Like, I think that was one of the things I realized people were not understanding. I was like, I tried to communicate it, but I didn't do it strongly enough. And I actually went back and did a revision where I was like, look, you might, even if you're the best reader, you might only, rely on a behavioral thing like a couple of times a session. And it might even be just a small thing where it makes you like slightly more likely to call pre-flop, on a standard raise. It's like, so I wanted to give that perception. I'm like, sure, there might be people that I don't know about, like Phil Ivey, that are always, using this a lot. But to the best of my knowledge, talking to strong players, it's something you occasionally use. And the worse your competition is, the more likely you are to use it. But when you start playing decent competition, it becomes less and less likely. And I think people appreciate having that realistic setting at the beginning, where it's like, look, you're not going to be like getting reads left and right. Like, that is not a realistic thing.
It's kind of like having a fire extinguisher in your house, right? It's not always valuable, but when you need it, it can be extremely, extremely valuable, right? For those times when a decision might hinge on a physical read, that might be the thing that tips the scale one way or the other. When you need it, it is extremely, extremely valuable.
Yeah, I think there's just so many spots I've seen in televised poker, big spots where it was like completely obvious from tells, from behavior, that somebody had a huge hand, and then a skilled player just still called. And I was like, yeah, even if you were only going to use tells for those obvious spots, like that would be such a big, a decent boost to win rate. And I'm just kind of like, when people say like, oh, it's not worth worrying about tells, I'm like, I've seen there's so many big hands that happen where it's like, come on, it's so clear what this guy has.
Yeah, it's almost dumbfounding to me. Again, looking at the pot odds model, how can somebody who is an expert, world class in their field, say, like, I'm not going to invest any energy into learning poker tells? You're playing like 50K and 100K high rollers. You're playing giant cash games. How much of an investment is it to read some books?
Yeah,
and
exactly. Yeah.
What does it cost you? On the top end, a few $1,000s. Okay, that seems like a pretty small investment that will pay for itself pretty quickly, just in educational value and in those giant pots that hinge on being able to identify something like that. It's dumbfounding to me why any human being that plays poker at a high level would not invest the time, just because the payoff is so large when you compare it to the investment.
Right. Yeah, totally.
All right, man. So just a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. What's a project you're working on currently that's near and dear to your heart?
I have an idea for a TV show that I occasionally work on, that I like to have more free time to work on, but kind of a psychology based sci-fi drama kind of thing, futuristic kind of thing. So yeah, I occasionally work on that. Like, I've just got some rough treatments of how the scripts would go, And so theoretically, I'll flesh those out into like more complete things and an arc for the season and or multiple seasons, things like that, and work on some full scripts.
You have contacts in the industry to submit those scripts to maybe actually make this thing happen?
I have theoretical contacts, like nothing like I'm very excited about, but I think I have enough contacts where it's like if they liked it, they might pass it to somebody else, that kind of thing, where it might work its way up. But I don't know. I don't really know. Even though I have a video film degree and have worked on some movies and stuff, not in any major regard, but I think it's tough to know how the landscape changes. Now you got Netflix and but on that regard, I think might be easier than ever because I think all these platforms are like desperate for content, and trying to compete with each other and make original content. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that Daniel Craig just got over $100 million from Netflix for the rights to Knives Out 2 and 3. I think they paid something around $400 million total for those two sequels, and that's a lot of money. And it goes to show you like that the competition between Disney, Hulu, Netflix, and Amazon is cutthroat to the death, and that's just makes it prioritizes content. It makes it very much in demand, and they're willing to pay a premium for it. So, yeah, I think best of luck to you there. I also have a contact if
cool.
if necessary in the future.
I'll keep you in the loop. Yeah, it might be a while. It takes a while to do these things.
Sure.
But thank you.
So, final question, man. Where can the Chasing Poker Greatness audience find more about Zachary Elwood on the World Wide Webs?
Probably go to readingpokertells.com. It has a summary of everything, all my stuff I'm involved in. And then follow me on Twitter at @apokerplayer. And check out my podcast. It's just about psychology in general, behavior stuff in general. And that's People Who Read People podcast. There's a link to that from the readingpokertells.com site.
Awesome, man. And all of this will be in the show page as well for the listener to click through. Thank you very much for your time and energy, Mr. Elwood.
Thank you, Brad.
Love to have you back on in a year or so, see how screenplay is progressing and what you're getting up to.
Oh, now I'm feeling the pressure, but thank you for the pressure. That's good.
Pressure's good.
Thanks,
see
Brad.
You, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Chasing Poker Greatness. If you have yet to subscribe to the show, please take a second to do so on Apple Podcasts or wherever your favorite place to listen to podcasts may be. For more content from me, Coach Brad, please visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/enhanceyouredge, and I'll see you next time.